Warning. This episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Give us 1 hour and we'll help you change the way you think about happiness. Harvesting Happiness with Lisa Cypers Kamen is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. Each week, Lisa spotlights diverse trendsetters and change agents who are the greatest contemporary thinkers and doers, devoting their lives to creating a better world in which to live. Your host, Lisa Cypers Kamen, is a widely recognized applied positive psychology expert, author, documentary filmmaker, and lecturer specializing in optimal lifestyle management. Let's get to it. Here's Lisa.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you are. Thanks for joining me on today's show where you will learn about conflict whispering, collaborate, communicate, and negotiate resolution. My first guest is Douglas Noll. Douglas E. Noll has a calling, and his is to serve humanity, and he executes his calling at many levels. Doug's work carries him into many dark places. Using pragmatic and practical skills of peace, he helps people resolve deep interpersonal and ideological conflicts. He's an award-winning author of 3 books, a teacher, speaker, and trainer, and his book is De-Escalate, How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less. Bring it, Doug. Let's go.
Hey, Lisa, how are you?
We only have a few seconds here. No, I'm just kidding.
How are you?
I am very well, very pleased to be with you because anger is such a heated subject.
Oh, talk about the timing. I mean, we live in a world, a very, very angry world today. Very
we do. Sad. But anger really isn't the problem, right? Anger is a secondary emotion.
Well, I there's a lot of debate about that. Emotion is a cognitive construct. If we're talking about affect, which is what's really happening in the brain, then anger, rage is one of the 9 basic affects that we're hardwired with. And it's triggered by boundary violations. People feel like they're violated, and so our natural response is anger, telling people, hey, don't tread on me. Right.
So we feel maybe that our peace or our safety are somehow compromised, and the brain really starts to emit a fight or flight response, right? It becomes very physiological.
Exactly. It starts with how the amygdala processes sensory data, and then that goes to the circuitry doesn't really matter, but it is instantaneous, almost instantaneous, and can in extreme situations be uncontrollable.
Yes, and it makes us stupid. In my experience,
that's right.
Being angry and dealing with a lot of anger, professionally with clients. I think we can agree that at the end of the day, we become a little punch drunk when we're angry.
Well, I think the way I prefer to look at it is that when we're highly emotional and the emotional circuits of the brain are completely activated, the ability of our prefrontal cortex to function and solve problems and make decisions is deeply impaired. And so, in the shortcut, we do get stupid. We literally cannot think our way through an emotional problem, which is why I say you can't solve an emotional problem with logic.
Yeah, so true, so true. So let's talk for a minute about being a lawyer and then turning into a peacemaker, which does sound like a contradiction in terms, but I actually think that they can go hand in hand.
Well, 2 of the most famous lawyers in history were Abraham Lincoln and Mahatma Gandhi, and they were both lawyers. And so lawyering and peacemaking have a long tradition. But my journey started, I graduated from law school in 1977, was a trial lawyer for 22 years. And what happened to me was that I picked up the martial arts and eventually became a second-degree black belt. And my teacher called me in after that and said, you're done here. You're too arrogant. You're too violent. You're a trial lawyer, second-degree black belt. You're gonna hurt somebody. And I must say the language that he used was a little bit more colorful than that. But then he said, so don't come back until you master Tai Chi. And that was a death sentence because you never master Tai Chi. So anyways, Tai Chi has 2 paradoxes. The softer you are, the stronger you are. The more vulnerable you are, the more powerful you are. That did not compute. But I kept practicing and eventually started teaching Tai Chi, and opened me up to a whole new spiritual dimension that I hadn't experienced before, at least at that level, and I became an energetic healer. And one day I was in the courtroom in a trial, and the thought came to me, what the heck am I doing in here? And after that trial, I took a week, 10 days off to really think about what I was doing. I went up to Idaho and ran the Maine salmon with a bunch of friends, and I spent the week in my wrap thinking about what I was doing and decided that trial work was no longer my thing. So I came back, and there was never any serendipity in my life. The one and only public service announcement that was ever broadcast on our local public radio station announced a new master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies being offered at Fresno Pacific University. And that's the West Coast Mennonite University. And for those that don't know, the Mennonites are one of the 3 traditional Protestant peace churches. So I decided to enter, and I entered as a master's student in the mid-1990s, and my eyes got opened to what human conflict is all about. And I left a very successful law practice in 2000 to become a peacemaker. And that's how it all started.
Let's talk about what peacemaking really means.
As I conceive of it, it's a 2-step process. It's de-escalating people who have very strong emotions and would rather shoot each other with AK-47s than sit down at the table and talk. And then once they're de-escalated, getting them into a collaborative problem-solving mode to solve the problem that has caused the emotion in the first place. And then ending with a durable, morally responsible, and accountable agreement that the parties are willing and excited to be bound to, where they're not being coerced into doing anything. That's peacemaking.
I love what you just said. The optimal result is durable and morally responsible agreement.
Correct.
Yeah, that sort of makes me sit up straight here. So let's talk about how we can use this premise in our everyday lives. I mean, people get flipped off quite easily. Tensions are high. People are stressed. We're in a political climate, and now an actual weather climate that is ripe for a lot of anger because we're tapping into basic primal survival.
That's right. So the de-escalation strategy I've developed I actually stumbled upon it by accident when my back was up against the wall in a very difficult mediation in Santa Barbara, of all places, in 2004. And then it turns out that the work what I discovered was validated by Matthew Lieberman, who's a neuroscientist at UCLA, who did some brain scanning studies to find out why this technique works so well. The technique is very simple. 3 steps. Step number 1, when you're confronted with somebody who's really angry, insulting, disrespectful, maybe incipient violence, number 1 is you ignore the words. For the next 90 seconds, ignore the words. They mean nothing. You've got to go against all your training, everything everybody told you to listen to the words, ignore them. They mean nothing. Step number 2, guess at the emotions. And step number 3, reflect back the emotional experience of the speaker with a very simple you statement. Lisa, you're really angry right now. You're really frustrated. You're really sad. You're feeling a lot of grief. You feel like you've been treated unfairly or unjustly. Nobody's listening to you. You feel unsupported. Whatever the emotions are, you simply reflect them back with a you statement. You don't use an I statement. You would not say something like, gee, what I think you're feeling is anger. And you don't ask a question. Are you angry? Simple, reflecting you statements. And what Lieberman's study shows is that when you do this process, it's called affect labeling. When you do this process, the emotional centers of the brain quiet down and the prefrontal cortex lights up. Essentially, what we're doing is we're lending this very angry, upset person our prefrontal cortex to help them process their emotional experience. And every time, the brain circuits quiet down almost instantly. Very powerful.
That is incredible. Oh my gosh. Very powerful and very simple, and it makes complete sense.
Yeah. And it's counterintuitive because we live in a culture where we don't pay attention to emotions. We look at emotions as being negative, bad, horrible. And in fact, we emotionally invalidate each other all the time, starting in early childhood. And so it never occurs to people to think about the emotional experience rather than the verbal insults that are coming across. And yet what Lieberman has showed us and what happens in the brains is that when we focus on the emotional experience, it provides an immediate calming effect. And I tested this for 7 years. I'm still doing it. In fact, I'm working in 9 California prisons, some of them maximum security level 4 prisons, working with murderers, teaching murderers to be peacemakers. And It works. It works every time.
It works if you work it, right? You've heard that expression before.
Yeah, you can make you can, as I tell the inmates, you have choices. You can engage in violence, you can walk away, or you can be a peacemaker and de-escalate and problem solve. Your choice. I just want to give you the tools so you have good choices to make.
Yeah, and everybody does want choice. At the end of the day, the anger usually, the root of the anger is somehow feeling as though we're out of control or choice has been eliminated from our toolbox in some way. It's been taken.
Right. And I find that a lot of anger is rooted in a sense of not being loved and feeling completely and totally alone and abandoned. At the bottom of the pool, that's what's driving this stuff.
Indeed. And we're also taught, maybe more so women than men, but I think that is changing with emotional intelligence being slowly but surely added to school curriculum, is that anger is bad.
Yes.
You don't want to be angry.
That's right.
Anger can be pretty useful sometimes.
Well, not only that, but by saying that anger is bad, we are denying 98% of who we are. We're 98% emotional and 2% rational. This idea that we're rational beings is totally a myth. It was invented by the Greeks 3,000 years ago, totally wrong, ungrounded in the science. The science tells us today that we can't even be rational until we're emotional first, because emotions tell us what to pay attention to, and they motivate us to take action. So that part of our brain that would engage in rational thinking can't even do that until we've had an emotion first that tells us we have to pay attention to something.
This is such an important key to successful relationship building, not just in resolving conflict and peacemaking, which of course we all say that we want peace in our lives, but we really do want good, solid, connected relationships where we feel that we're seen, heard, understood, etc. And what I see you offering here is a way to do that in sort of 3 easy steps that take practice to get good at.
That's right. This is something that's. I tell my students at Pepperdine, practice this for a couple of weeks before you try it on your spouse. Do this in low-risk environments, low-risk social environments, until you get used to it, because it's so different. It feels so weird to label somebody's emotions that we just can't get our heads around the idea that it really does work. And I said, don't listen to the great Doug Noll. Go out and use the laboratory of the world and experiment and figure it out yourself. And they do. They come back and report amazing things.
Well, listen, the great Doug Noll and I have to trot off to a break here. So the book we're talking about is De-Escalate, How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less. We're going to go to a break. We're going to come back and we're going to carry on more of the conversation. To learn more about Doug Noll, please visit www.dougnoll.com. On Twitter, you can connect up with him at Doug Noll, and on Facebook, Douglas Noll. Here comes the pause. We'll be right back.
To learn more about cultivating sustainable well-being at home and the office, visit harvestinghappiness.com and explore Lisa's experiential on-site brain fitness workshops, corporate programming, and speaking engagement services.
And we're back, continuing the conversation with Douglas Noll. We're talking about conflict whispering. Collaborate, communicate, and negotiate resolution. Let's get back to the conversation. So, Doug, prior to the break, we were talking about this 3-step process that really can help quell or soothe anger in another person. But before we move on to that component, I think it's important to have a little conversation about the difference between conversation and listening.
Right. So when we're engaged in normal social conversation, if you pay attention, you'll find that the conversation is always about you. I'm going to talk about me, and Lisa, you're going to talk about you. And we'll kind of flip-flop back and forth, but we're really not listening to each other the way that we would if we really needed to listen. When we are in a set of rules, social rules, norms of behavior around listening, around conversations exist. There are implicit rules, such as we don't interrupt and we wait our turn and that sort of thing. When we're listening, we're doing something very, very different. As a listener, we are only reflecting from the speaker's point of reference. So when I say you are angry, it's not I think you're angry or what I hear you saying is angry, because as soon as I use the I word, I'm in my frame of reference. So when I'm listening, I'm always going to be in your frame of reference, and the only thing I'm going to reflect, at least at the deepest levels, is what your emotional experience is. And different rules apply here, because I can reflect your emotional experience as frequently as I want. And in fact, I demonstrate to the amazement of students and people in my workshops that you can literally label emotions every 3 to 4 seconds. And in normal conversation, that would be considered rude and disruptive. And I'll ask people, what do you see? And people will say, well, that's the rudest, most disruptive thing I've ever seen. And then I ask the speaker, what do you experience? And the speaker will say, almost invariably, I've never been listened so deeply before in my life.
Interesting. And what comes to mind as you were speaking was activating empathy. That
yes.
Really this process is, because you're coming at it from the perspective of you or the other, that you are automatically placing yourself in someone else's shoes.
Correct. This is a way to create, a very practical way to create a very deep empathic connection almost instantly. Everybody talks about empathy, but nobody really teaches us how to do it. This is how you do it.
So we're in empathy school at this moment.
We're in empathy school right now. Right?
We are an empathy activation program right here, right now on Harvesting Happiness.
And let me say there are reasons why. There are a lot of people who say, heck, that SOB, I don't want to be empathic with him. Let me talk for a minute about the benefits to you, the listener, when you do this. 2 things happen to you. First of all, you are totally grounded. So people can be spitting in your face with insults and provocations, and you will not feel the slightest bit of anger or upset. You'll be totally grounded and centered because you're focusing on their emotions. You're ignoring the words, so you're centered. But here's the really cool part. Because you're focusing on their emotions, you lose your ego just for about 10 or 15 seconds, and you actually have a transcendent experience of oneness. And it happens every single time you do this. And it puts you into a blissful state. So it's a spiritual practice, too. Absolutely unbelievable.
I hear you. I deal with some cantankerous characters, and I find that I place myself in their shoes in this way, not exactly in this 3-pronged approach, although I'm going to start trying it today. But really, once you do that, when you see somebody beneath what they're saying, beneath the words, and you see actually at a soul level, I mean, now I'm going to go to a different place with it.
That's right.
You don't see separateness.
That's right. That's the great power of this, is that not only are you de-escalating and calming down this very angry, potentially violent person in front of you, but you're soothing yourself, you are staying calm and centered, you're empowering yourself, and you're having a transcendent experience while you're doing it. I mean, how cool is that?
It's beautiful. It truly is beautiful. Let's talk a minute about how to apply this to having a politically polarized conversation, because this has really split up even families. And I've noticed this even in my own family, where we had some fence jumpers, and I won't say which side or the other, right. But it was really hard, and it continues to be really hard as things change in the climate.
That's right.
I'm being nice when I say that.
I understand. It's so difficult to talk about this subject without offending somebody. But here's how I approach it. First of all, if I'm engaged with somebody who's politically polarized and they have radically different beliefs than I do, if they're escalated, I will de-escalate. I'll simply validate their emotional experience, reflect back their emotions, get them calmed down. Then I'm going to, if I'm compelled or to engage them in conversation, my first question is always going to be this: What happened in your life? What are your life experiences that brought you to the beliefs that you have today? Tell me how you came to these beliefs. What in your life led you to this belief structure? Yeah. And so now I'm asking for a story, and I'm asking for an autobiography, which I will listen to and reflect on. The next question I might ask is, how do your beliefs guide you? How do these beliefs that you have guide you in your everyday life? How do they help you make decisions and kind of navigate where you're going in life? And nobody's ever asked these questions before, so they have to think about it. And then the third question I might ask is, how do you deal with people who have different beliefs than you do? How do you navigate that? And how do you keep yourself from getting really crazy? Or if you do get crazy, is that the way you want to live? Notice that in all of these questions, I never ask about the beliefs themselves.
Yep.
I only ask about the effects of the beliefs and how the beliefs were formed, because the beliefs themselves are not important. What's important is how they guide decisions and guide behaviors.
It's interesting because I have asked people who are politically very different than myself. I mean, I'm curious. I want to know what motivates a person to have the beliefs that they hold. And oftentimes they can't really explain it.
That's correct, which is why you don't ask about their beliefs. You ask about the life experiences they've had.
Yeah.
And that will give you information about why they formed the beliefs they had. There are very few people who can adequately and clearly and cogently describe what their belief structures are. All they know is they've got a feeling about this, and they can't even articulate that very well. But if you can engage them in storytelling, they can get a lot of information, and you can get a lot of information too. And this is where you find out that there's so much common ground.
Yes, that at the end of the day, that our needs, our desires, and our wants in life are more united than they are disparate.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. So that's how we have conversations with the politically polarized. We don't try to persuade. We don't try to argue. All the science shows us, brain scanning studies by Drew Weston and his people at Emory show that when you confront somebody who has a deeply seated political belief with facts that are true but contradictory to that belief, dopamine is released in the brain to strengthen and embed the belief even deeper. You're just making people more stubborn. They physiologically cannot let go of their beliefs in the face of contradictory but true information. They can't. All it does is strengthen their beliefs. And you see how this causes polarization, because people become more and more entrenched as they are confronted with facts, not fake news, but real news. And they can't, they're in cognitive dissonance, and all it does is strengthen their belief.
Oh, I mean, I have teenagers and young adults, so I know what you're talking about. And my guess is that you do too, or have had.
By the way, these skills work really well with teenagers. If you really want to see a behavioral change in a teenager, just de-escalate by labeling that teen's emotions in the moment and watch what happens. It'll blow you away. I've taught middle school and high school teachers how to do this, and they say the classroom management problems go away. They just disappear.
I would think so, because oftentimes the teenager can't articulate his or her own emotion at all.
That's exactly right.
They don't even know. And it's funny, I work with young adults most days of the week, and I often ask them about, defining their emotions, what's going on, and they say they don't even know how to define their emotions. And in my case, it's early recovery from substance abuse.
That's right.
And so there are other things going on in the brain that, the brain is repairing. So this is a really, really valid point. Let's talk about evil and violence. How do you mediate and attempt to peacemake in the midst of that?
First of all, you have to be careful about terms. So what does evil mean? One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Yeah. So you've got to, to me, I think that you're really looking at evil as something that is morally so repugnant and reprehensible that it cannot be tolerated. And so genocide, for example, is an example of evil. What you need to do as a peacemaker, you have to suspend judgment, because you're trying to de-escalate and problem solve and engage people. So you have to become non-judgmental about stuff that would otherwise probably you would consider to be morally reprehensible. And you have to seek to understand, listen, engage, de-escalate, and find out what are the underlying causes of this behavior. And a lot of times it's despicable what the causes are. But you still have to take the time to figure out what the causes are, if you can, and find out if there are other ways of solving the problem other than through morally reprehensible acts. It's difficult work because you do have to suspend judgment to work with what most people would be considered to be evil. But I'll tell you, I've worked in maximum security prisons with some people who have done some pretty awful things, and I know that they can be worked with, and I know they can be trained as powerful peacemakers, and I know they can be de-escalated, and I know they can be reflective if they're approached the right way. And these are people that you would see on the street and run as fast as you could the other way when you look at them. And yet they turn out to be some of the most powerful peacemakers I've ever worked with and ever trained.
I agree with you. I have had the experience of working with the population you describe, and it was very similar to yours, that there is a lot of power. And sometimes most of the time, in my view, these are good people that made bad choices,
That's true. And there are also people, the other thing that we have to understand about when we're talking about moral reprehensibility is that a lot of times people engage in heinous acts because they have been deeply traumatized themselves.
Indeed.
Every single murderer I've worked with in prison has a life story of trauma and abuse that just is awful. Awful.
Will you come back and talk about that another time? Because
anytime you want.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very powerful conversation because, we're talking about morality and judgment and other forms of emotional and social intelligence that do lead us to a path of a more satisfying life once we activate them. We're out of time, and I want to send listeners over to your website at www.dougnoll.com, on Twitter at Doug Noll, and on Facebook, Douglas Noll. The book is De-Escalate, How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less. Doug, thank you so much.
Let's grab a quick pause. We'll be right back.
Did you know that happiness is actually good for your health? Happy people live longer, are more productive, and make better partners, parents, and professionals. Connect with us on Facebook at Harvesting Happiness and follow Lisa on Twitter at Lisa Kamen for a daily dose of inspiration.
And we're back. Let's get back to it. We're talking with Jim Tamm about conflict whispering, collaborate, communicate, and negotiate resolution. He's a former judge and an expert on dispute resolution and building collaborative relationships. He has mediated more than 1,000 employment disputes during his 25 years as a senior administrative law judge for the state of California. James is currently a managing director of the international consulting firm Business Consultants Network, Inc., and he is in the house talking about his newest book, Radical Collaboration: 5 Essential Skills to Overcome Defensiveness and Build Successful Relationships. Welcome, Jim. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Lisa. It's good to be here.
Oh, it is very good to be here for so many reasons. First of all, talking is one of my passions. Having heartfelt conversations makes me joyful, and the world needs successful communicators these days. And I'm so glad that you have written a book on ways in which we can improve. Let's talk about the 5 pillars or skills of the book, Radical Collaboration.
Sure. We started out looking at what made the difference, and we've been able to narrow it down to 5 key skills that we think are essential. One we call collaborative intention, which is having the ability to stay focused on mutual gains in your relationships. When you hit one of those speed bumps in the road, somebody makes a mistake or does something that you don't understand, do you get furious or can you get curious? The second skill we call openness, which is having the ability to create an environment where people feel psychologically safe enough to raise difficult issues and actually deal with them. The third skill we call self-accountability, which is people taking responsibility for the circumstances around their life and recognizing the choices that they're making, either through action or failing to act. The fourth skill we call self-awareness, and particularly a focus about their own defensiveness, increasing their awareness about their own defensiveness, because nothing undermines collaboration more, especially in someone in a leadership role, more than getting defensive. And then the last one is being able to skillfully negotiate your way through conflict that's going to be inevitable in any long-term relationship, and doing it in a way that supports the relationship rather than undermines it.
This sounds like the recipe for a happy life. Let alone for, when you just think, when you think about how we communicate, like if we could just do this, it's all going to be good.
Well, we started out working primarily with organizations, with unions and management in organizations. And what we found is after we were doing the work with these groups, they would come to us and say, I'd like to bring my kids here. I'd like to bring my spouse here next time we're doing this. Because everything we're talking about here works equally in an organization or in a family or with your neighbors, or your kids and their friends. They're basic, effective relationship building skills that can be applied anywhere.
And we are sorely in need of them today. I mean, we've been forced by what's going on around us in the world, by the pandemic and political unrest and all the other craziness that is out there in the world. We've really been forced to, I think, adjust the way that we communicate. And maybe that's not for the better.
The world today is an invitation for everyone to get defensive.
Yeah.
And when we get defensive, we're not nearly as effective. Our IQ drops. We simply become stupid. And so it's very difficult to maintain relationships when you have so much chaos going on and so many problems that we have to deal with all at the same time. And then we're stuck in the same place for so long. It's hard to get away from some people sometimes.
You know that pod that you live with? I mean, I happen to love my pod, but there are times when I just I just would like to go out and play in somebody else's pod.
That's right.
And,
That's right.
And, how do we effectively negotiate our way through conversations that aren't easy to have? And what pops into my mind as you and I are talking is curiosity, right? To really activate some empathy that activates curiosity to try and wonder what it would be like to be in the other person's shoes.
Yeah. It's a wonderful tool. We use that a lot. In fact, when I was mediating labor management disputes, oftentimes I would start the parties off talking about what the other side's point of view was. And of course, they would usually get it wrong, so they would have to ask a lot of questions to understand. And when they approached it that way, with that curious mind that you're talking about, it made a huge difference in understanding both points of view. And then moving on to solutions. Oftentimes we want to rush into solutions anytime we have a dispute without really understanding where the other party's coming from. So if you can have that curious mindset, it makes a huge positive difference.
And then when we talk about your first point about collaborative intention, the attitude or the spirit with which we arrive to the party, right? Like, do we want to be right or do we want to be happy? And a lot of people out there will say, well, I want both.
Yeah. And that's possible. But a lot of times people make an easy either or choice, between being right or being in a relationship. Yeah. And they don't realize that, well, to be in a relationship, oftentimes you need to adjust your own thinking.
And when we talk about radical collaboration for the next steps of our country, in the recovery, repair, and healing mode and reunification, I think, by following these steps is really, really helpful because right now we're so polarized. We see ourselves as separate from the other when in fact that is a myth.
The only way that we'll ever overcome that is by getting curious about what's going on with the other party. There isn't any other way around that. I think it takes a mind shift that is lacking certainly in the political spectrum today.
And I think asking powerful, open-ended questions of the other, like, I don't necessarily understand your beliefs. I would like to understand your beliefs. I want to know where you're coming from because at the end of the day, your needs and your desires are not separate or particularly different than mine. Not really.
Yeah, oftentimes, if we can get parties that are in a dispute to be asking those kinds of questions, and they have a better understanding of what the real interests are of both parties, they're able to come up with lots of different ways of meeting those interests. And usually when we go into a dispute, the way that we've learned to negotiate is we usually look at the problem from our point of view, we come up with our favorite solution, then we go to the other party and we try to convince them that our favorite solution is better than their favorite solution. So it's part of an education process to try and slow them down and get them to understand what the interests are of the other party, because they can be so much more creative. Usually, if you really understand what someone's underlying interests are, there's oftentimes many, many ways of meeting those interests. And it doesn't have to be your favorite solution. You can still get those interests met. So that's part of the mind shift there of slowing things down, not getting stuck on your own favorite solution, getting curious about the other side, and it really helps in finding more solutions.
What about the call to suspend judgment?
Well, that's part of the slowing down process. One of the reasons why it's so difficult when people come up with their own favorite solution early on in a process is because they get fixated on that, and it's hard to let go of it. So if they can avoid coming up with this framework in their own mind about this is the solution that we have to have, well, the best way to do that is to suspend any judgment at all until they have a better sense of what's going on. But it's like in a conversation, oftentimes we're more focused on what we're going to say next than we are listening to the other party. It's the same with conflict resolution. You need to be able to let go of what you're going to say next, have that open mindset, try and really truly hear what the other party is trying to explain. That's what you're talking about.
That is what I'm talking about. And when we talk about the art of listening, which I would love to get into more deeply in the second segment that we're together, the teaching others how to fully listen is really important. And there is an art to it. And it's not something that a lot of us are comfortable with, right? Because it requires being willing to meet somebody where they're at, by being willing to make deep eye contact, to be intimate in ways that society often tells us, oh, don't do that. That's just too close.
Yeah, I find that in my work with conflicts that people think they're very good listeners. I mean, it's probably the most often trained skill and the least used skill of anything that we find in business these days. Just about everybody in their life has gone through a listening exercise, and we think we're good at it, but most of us really suck at it. Yeah. Because we're not paying attention to where the other side is really coming from. And that's having that curious mindset again. If I really want to understand what that person feels, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, how this impacts their life. If you can go into a situation like that, it makes a huge difference.
Do you think there is a fear of intimacy, though, that when we go into that state of deep listening, it requires a level of surrender and vulnerability that a lot of us are not typically used to or comfortable with? So we're exposed.
Yeah, it requires us to give up a sense of certainty.
Yeah.
I mean, most of us, when we're listening to the other side, we have strong feelings about whether they're right or wrong. And so this requires you to give up that sense of certainty, which can create some chaos in our own mind. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, I'm sort of free floating here.
Yeah. But that's that sort of very special place where the magic can happen, right?
That's right. That's right.
We are going to take a break, and we'll be right back, and we'll continue the conversation with my guest today, Jim Tamm. To learn more about Jim's work, please go to radicalcollaboration.com, on Twitter @radcollabo, and on Facebook, it's Radical Collaboration. The book we're speaking of today is Radical Collaboration: 5 Essential Skills to Overcome Defensiveness and Build Successful Relationships. Here comes that pause. We'll be right back, and that is a promise.
Who says money can't buy happiness? Whether you are a skeptic or seeker, check out Lisa's new book. Are we happy yet? 8 Keys to Unlocking a Joyful Life, a boot camp manual for greater emotional fitness, is available at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, IndieBound, and HarvestingHappiness.com. Here's a truth bomb. Emotions are contagious, and happiness is a universally desired state. But we tend to forget that we all have the freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable each day, regardless of external circumstances. Explore the journey of human happiness, how to find it and keep it, with Lisa's documentary film, H Factor. Where is your heart? Visit HarvestingHappiness.com to learn more.
And we're back, continuing the conversation about conflict whispering, collaborate, communicate, and negotiate resolution. Let's get back to it with my guest, Jim Tamm. So, Jim, prior to going to break, we touched a little bit about the art of listening. And I wanted to just, wrap that up and move on to the next subject, which is very, very interesting. So there's lots of material out there on how to be a better listener.
Yeah, there is. And from my point of view, the thing that gets in the way the most, more than anything else that I've seen, is when we get defensive. We just become lousy listeners when we get defensive. And so it might be helpful to explore this whole issue about defensiveness now.
Yes. And that is a communication style, isn't it? Defensiveness.
Yeah. Well, what happens, most people think that when we get defensive, it's because somebody has done something to us and we need to defend ourselves from that other person. But that's not really what's going on when we get defensive. Now, there are times when you need to defend yourself. We have bad people in the world, and we have to pay attention to that. But when we get defensive, what we're doing is we're behaving in a way, defending ourselves from fears inside of us that we don't want to feel. 3 big fears that come up all the time that drive us into defensiveness are fears about our own significance, our competence, and our likability. Let me give you an example of that, Lisa. Say I have some fears about my own competency for doing this interview today. Say I've didn't get a good night's sleep last night and I'm doing a bad job and I can't think of what I want to say and it's taking things out of order and no one's enjoying it, Now, that could cause me a lot of discomfort because I like to feel competent. So one of the ways that I could behave so I don't feel incompetent is I could start blaming you. You didn't give me enough time. You're asking the wrong questions. This is a dumb time for an interview, whatever it might be. So it seems like I'm defending myself from the interviewer, from you, but what I'm really doing is I'm behaving in a way that lets me not have to deal with my own fear. So what can be really helpful is for people to try to get a better understanding of when they're getting defensive at an earlier point in the process. Yeah. Because when we get defensive, our thinking becomes rigid, our IQ drops, and we're just not very good at solving problems. So what we try to do is we try to get people to spot their defensiveness at an earlier point in the process, before it's too late, before they're doing the damage, while they can still do something about it.
It's interesting what you say about spotting the defensiveness, because I find when I'm in conversation with others, and myself included sometimes where I get defensive, that I will go into that, or others will go into that deflect and project paradigm.
Yeah, that's a really common sign of defensiveness. We have in the book, we've got a list of 50 different signs, like loss of humor, high charge of energy in the body, wanting to be right, wanting the last word, obsessive thinking, blaming or shaming, And what we suggest is people go through and try to get a better understanding of what their defensive behaviors are, because that can be our early warning system for them. So, for example, I notice when I get defensive, I start talking louder, I start breathing faster, I feel very misunderstood. So if I'm in an interview or in a room filled with people and I'm getting some feedback and I notice myself doing that, the alarm bells can go off. Ding, ding, ding. Hey, Jim, pay attention. You're doing that thing again. So it can warn me before I do damage. Then I have time to take some action. And I can do something to try to moderate the damage of that defensiveness.
I have a scenario to ask you about, and I think this is a very common one. And this may be gender-based, and I accept that if you say that to me. I often notice that when partners and spouses will bicker, that one of the techniques that the other, and that person shall remain nameless, but what about when you do this? But what about when you do that? So, and rather than just dealing with what the statement is, I'll make something up, you didn't take out the trash. What about the time that you forgot to do this, and this, rather than say, oh, damn, I just forgot to take out the trash.
Well, that's become a classic in today's political world.
Yeah.
This, what aboutism?
Yes.
That's a classic example of defensiveness. Yeah. It's classic. So, see, now if a person knows that that's what they do when they get defensive, And then all of a sudden they hear themselves saying, well, what about you? The alarm bells,
Yes.
Notice, okay? Then that gives them the opportunity to say, okay, wait a minute, I'm getting defensive, because that's the first step that you have to do if you want to deal more effectively with your own defensiveness. You have to notice that you're getting defensive and acknowledge it to yourself. So you notice it, you acknowledge it. Then oftentimes when we get defensive, our brain goes into tunnel vision. Part of our prefrontal cortex shuts down.
Oh, yeah.
And we see it, like we're looking through this telescope. So you need to re-engage your whole brain, and you can do that by maybe looking around the room and seeing how many different colors you see or what noises you hear, but something to focus outward to get rid of that tunnel vision. Then you want to focus inward to see if you can figure out what the fear is about. Then what you can do is come up with an action plan, some very specific step that you can engage in that'll reduce the amount of damage. So if your sign of defensiveness is flooding with information to prove a point, then maybe you just be quiet for 10 or 15 seconds. Now that won't help you if your sign is withdrawal into deadly silence. Then you need to ask a question, something to stay engaged in the conversation. If it's high charge of energy, maybe you take a walk or take a few deep breaths. If it's all or nothing thinking, maybe say to yourself, look for the gray, something like that. So it's not all just black or white.
What I hear you suggesting are these little micro interventions that don't actually take up much time, but can ground you back in the room in the conversation.
Absolutely. And the more you do it, the more practiced you'll get at it too, because you want this to be automatic. If you see that defensive behavior, you take this action, see it, do it. So you practice. And the best way to do that is just think of a time, go back in your mind, think of a time when you did get defensive. What would you have wanted to do? How would you have wanted to behave to be at your most effective? So it's like having a little after action review. And even though you're doing this in your own imagination, you're creating new neural pathways in your brain. And so if you keep doing this, that's going to help over the long run. Now, nothing is going to help you get rid of it as much eventually as trying to figure out what the underlying fear is there, whether it's a fear of not being competent or not being important, that people aren't going to like you, whatever the fear might be. You're going to need to deal with that eventually. But if you just practice those little simple steps of looking for your signs and then taking an action plan, that's going to help over time quite a bit.
It makes perfect sense. It's very logical, what you're describing, and what I believe will be helpful to people by reading this book is understanding that it is the repetition, it is the practice, the neuroplasticity of the brain that eventually adopts the new habit of response in a different way, in a new way.
So I get a lot of questions. Well, what if I can stay non-defensive, but I'm dealing with people who are defensive? The advice I have for them then is, well, it's the least effective thing you can do is point out to the other party that they're getting defensive. So the best thing you can do is try not to get triggered by their defensiveness. You stay non-defensive, and you're always going to be much more effective at dealing with somebody who's defensive, and then put more energy into listening, because oftentimes people will get defensive when they're not feeling heard. So those are a couple good tips there.
That is a great idea, actually, is to get busy with the listening, because then the other person feels as though they're valued. You really want to hear what they have to say.
Exactly.
Which reduces the tension, which reduces the energy in the room. Mm-hmm. This is very, very helpful and useful information. The book we're talking about is Radical Collaboration, 5 Essential Skills to Overcome Defensiveness and Build Successful Relationships. My fabulous guest has been Jim Tamm. To learn more about Jim and his work, please visit radicalcollaboration.com. On Twitter @RadCollabo, and on Facebook, that page is Radical Collaboration.
Thank you, Lisa.
Oh, thank you, Jim. This was great. Thanks for joining us on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen on behalf of my guests, Douglas Noll and Jim Tamm, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Please go out and rock your day, and remember to be kind to one another.
Keep harvesting your own happiness anytime and anywhere, from the comfort of wherever you are. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes via our free app or from our libraries at toginet.com, iTunes, Google Play, and other fine podcast platforms. To learn more about Lisa's global consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Spread more joy by liking us on Facebook at Harvesting Happiness and following Lisa on Twitter at Lisa Kamen. Harvesting Happiness is produced in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU Radio Malibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.